Hello friends, back at it today with a continuation of our Introduction to Bourbon series. So if you've not had a chance to check out the prior videos, please go take a look at them. The first deals with the history of whiskey and bourbon and the Bottled in Bond Act. Second talks a little bit about single barrels and the Four Roses distillery. And so for our third iteration here, we're going to be talking about the Kentucky Peerless distillery to illustrate the sweet mash process. So as I've said before, this is aimed at people who are maybe whiskey enthusiasts, but bourbon novices. And just to give you a bit of the fundamentals and some of the specific technical stuff that goes into generating the aromas and the flavors that we so prize in bourbon. So let's talk about Kentucky Peerless. They are a startup craft distillery. This distillery is named after a distillery that closed during Prohibition that was actually owned by the grandfather of the brothers that owned this one. And the reason that I wanted to highlight this is that they're doing something very differently from the big distilleries. And, you know, a craft distiller that I know recently joked that the world's worst sales pitch is, my craft bourbon tastes almost as good as Four Roses and it only costs twice as much. But in actuality, unfortunately, that's what we get a lot of the time. And the reason is that the large industrial scale distilleries, and especially the master distillers that run them, are really, really good at making whiskey. They require no tutoring, no improvement. They can make bourbon just fine. And so to stand out and to justify the premium price that's necessary to make craft economics work, given that there are significant diseconomies of scale relative to running a big industrial-sized distillery, is that craft distillers have to do something different. They can't just be trying to make straight bourbon whiskey from a sour mash process the way that everybody else in Kentucky does. So what does Kentucky Peerless do differently that makes them worthy of our consideration? Well, the answer is sweet mash, which is different than the sour mash process that most bourbon is made with. So let's pause there for a second. We're going to talk about mashing. So you have your grains. You got corn, rye, and malted barley in this case. And the first step is to grind them finely, and then they go through what's called the mashing process. And this process uses the enzymes in the grains to convert the starch to sugar in preparation for the next step, fermentation, where yeast will convert that sugar to alcohol. And the way you do this is you add water to the grains, and then you heat it enough that the enzymes can work, but not hot enough to kill them off. Now, back in the 1700s and 1800s, they noticed that what they called this beer of water and grain would occasionally spoil. And they didn't understand anything back then about microorganisms or bacteria, which is what caused the spoilage, but this was a problem. So they invented the sour mash process. And in the sour mash process, you take some of the liquid from the prior batch's fermentation, then you add it to the mash. And a way to think about this is, if you're a baker or you're familiar with baking, you've got this idea of like a starter for sourdough, right? And that's similar to what's going on here. And so what using that does is establishes an acidic, low pH environment in which the yeast and the enzymes can flourish, but the bacteria cannot. And there are some flavor trade-offs with that. So you end up having to distill the resultant beer to a higher strength in order to get some of those off flavors that are introduced during the sour mash process out of there. So let's talk about what you might do differently. Well, if you had a brand new distillery with modern equipment that was all stainless steel that you could clean via steam, you wouldn't have to worry about bacteria or microorganisms contaminating your beer, and therefore you wouldn't have to add that sour mash back to the mash in order to create the sour mash process. And so therefore you wouldn't have any of those off flavors, and it would potentially create a completely different flavor profile. So that's what Kentucky Peerless does. They have a sweet mash, which doesn't add any of that sourness. And again, because it's a brand new distillery with modern equipment, they can eliminate all that bacteria. And the other nice part of this is they don't have to distill to as high a proof. And so the whiskey enters the barrel at lower proof. And that has all sorts of implications for the maturation process. When the whiskey is going into and coming out of the barrel, it's solubilizing the organic compounds in the barrel, and that's what gives whiskey its color and flavor. And so you'll notice this one, despite being just a couple years old, has that very lovely dark color that you associate with whiskey. You know, I mean, if you gave me that blind and said, how old is this whiskey? I'd say 8, 10, 12 years old, right? I mean, this looks like mature whiskey, even though this one in particular is only about 4 years old. And again, that's an output of the fact that you're entering the barrel at lower proof. Things are happening over a different time scale than with a much higher barrel entry proof. And if you've had the chance to taste this, or indeed comparably aged whiskeys from other distilleries that are doing the same thing. So a couple that jump to mind immediately are Wilderness Trail, also in Kentucky, Woodinville in Washington State. You get this flavor profile that is completely mature tasting and very different relative to what you get with a whiskey produced with the sour mash profile. And it would be interesting if you were able to get your hands on one of these bottles, and then a bottle of whiskey, and any bottle of whiskey pretty much, with the sour mash process, that you could taste the difference and see how those manifest themselves in the actual and bourbon. What I find is that there's a cleanliness to it, which makes sense if you think about the differences in the process that I've just elucidated. But there's also a lightness to this, or a leanness to this. And I don't mean that sense of whiskey tastes thin sometimes, but I mean that in the sense of, I think I said to Matt Cusick in one of our conversations, it's like a welterweight boxer. It's very, very, very lean, but packs an incredible punch. And indeed, this is coming at us in batch proof, which is in this case 54.85% ABV. And that's another thing I really like about Peerless. Low barrel entry proof, but they don't have to then proof it down to get to a presentable level. It's coming to you at 109.7, and so it's a great, again, going back to that thing that I led with at the beginning of the first video. Why is stuff done the way it is? Well, oftentimes if it's not a result of laws and regulations, just because there's tradition, because it's always been done that way. When you've had companies that have had the sour mash process, which by the way was invented by Dr. James Crow. If you know of Old Crow whiskey, he was the originator, or one of the first folks to really point that out as being a major improvement in quality control, which again for the time it was. But Jim Beam wants the next bottle of Jim Beam just to taste like every other single bottle of Jim Beam that came before it, or Wild Turkey, or whoever, right? There's a disinclination on the part of the big distilleries to change anything, because again, it's always been done that way, and they want to maintain that consistency. You're unburdened of that when you look for craft whiskey. They can do things the way they want, and what I look for when I'm looking for craft whiskey is somebody, again, that's doing something different, that's seeking out flavors that you're not going to get from the big distilleries, and that's what's going to justify that price premium and make you want to pay up for those bottles of whiskey. So that's all I got to tell you about Sweet and Sour Mash, and indeed about Kentucky Peerless. But if you go to www.malt-review.com, you can find an interview that I did with Caleb Kilburn, who is the master distiller at Kentucky Peerless, and he was very generous in sharing a whole ton of his time and insight with me to explain in depth why they do what they do and how they do it. So please go check that out if this piqued your interest. But hopefully these are informative and helpful, and to the extent that you guys keep liking them, I'm going to keep doing them. So more to come in the series. The next video we're going to do is going to be talking about Maker's Mark, which you will know is a favorite distillery of mine, and we'll be talking about wheated mash bills. So far we've only talked about rye mash bills, but there's some wheat coming in the near future. So really appreciate the time, really appreciate the attention. Thank you guys for letting me do this. So thanks once again. Find some Kentucky Peerless if you can, but in the meantime, I will see you soon. So cheers.